I want to do a little Tomcast about keeping and reusing your old stuff. And what I mean by this is sometimes you'll start working on a project or you'll start working on an idea, but it doesn't capture you, it doesn't really have the interest, or because of your time commitments, because of your resources, because of, external factors, you aren't able to actually complete the project. Now, sometimes you will have these sort of like outline documents that essentially become abandoned. And what you end up having to do is just either store them, or I suppose you could delete them, or sometimes they get kind of put somewhere that kind of get lost or something. But for me, now that I keep a lot of those items digitally, it's a lot easier for me to first of all just keep them around, and second of all, either find them again or search them or find a different use for them. So I talked earlier, probably in my earlier Tomcast, about starting a new project and being a little frustrated with that. So one of the things I decided to do was to look back at some of my older, ideas that I had. I wanted to look back at some of my older ideas, see what was working, see what wasn't, and by doing that, I was able to sort of coalesce and kind of bring some of those old ideas back in because they're probably still good ideas, but maybe if they just didn't have enough with them, now that I have a project, now that I have some other ideas, stuff from maybe other projects I thought of, by taking all of those and combining them together, you can kind of start to get something that becomes a real project. So this idea of like always keeping and kind of, I don't want to say hoarding your old stuff, but having it around. There'll be a time when you need to come up with an idea for something and you won't have a lot of time to do it. That's a really stressful, hard sort of place to be creative in. But if you record the times when inspiration strikes, if you keep track of these sort of older times when you had these ideas, then when you have to come up with something really fast, you can bring them all in and at least have something to sort of work with. I think there's another side of like having old stuff and keeping it around and combining it with other stuff. Is because what it does is it starts to get you away from like the blank page problem. And I think that's kind of what I was running into earlier on with my project. I knew like professionally what I wanted to do, but I didn't know artistically what I wanted to do. So by coming back with some of my older projects or older ideas that were more artistically driven, I could kind of bring that in and say, hey, this is what I want to do. This is stuff that I, can use to sort of start building out, a game design document, just, or really just a plan of what you're going to need. There's sort of a weirdness to like me coming up with ideas as well, is that I find myself, especially when I'm going into the same space, I find myself repeating ideas a lot. In one sense it's a little bit scary because I realize I'm not changing or I'm not adapting or maybe I'm not being influenced by things, but it's also reassuring because it means that the ideas that I had 2 or 3 years ago are still going to be relevant to me now or maybe in the future. And there are times too when it isn't relevant, and the part of just being in the creative field of game design, and the fact that like it takes so long to make a game and it takes so much resources, and you're generally probably a creative person. What that means is like you're gonna have more ideas and games you can make. Part of game design as well is recognizing that you may have ideas for things, but you may not be the person who can actually do them. That kind of goes against sort of a sense that I think a lot of developers, a lot of professionals sort of develop because, especially if you're working for other people, it's not really your job to say no. It's your job to say yes. It's your job to find a way. It's your job to figure it out. When you're sort of leading a project or when you're sort of starting a project by yourself and you have to like, I relate things back to game jams because that's the scale and scope that I'm used to. If you try to do something you cannot do or you're not the best person for doing, you could have a really difficult time with that. And I'm not saying, a game jam, you should only be doing what you know. A game jam is a great time to do what you know, but also learn one new thing. But I am trying to say that you need to be aware of your own skill set. For me, I'm not as much of a digital artist as many other people are. If I took a project on that was like highly devoted to building lots of digital art, if I wanted to make some sort of Pokemon clone or something like that, that would be a terrible idea for me because I'm not going to be able to sit down and make like 50 different, little monster dudes who want to, fight each other or do something. But when you're thinking about things, you're getting ideas, you tend to gravitate toward ideas that you think about or that you know. In a way, it's sort of like a dream. If you keep thinking about the same thing, you'll have a dream about it. If you keep thinking about certain things, you'll have ideas about them. So that means when you're building a new project or you're starting out a new thing, you have this sort of built in notion of you trying to reinforce what you're already good at or what you're already thinking about. So you'll have that motivation there to build what you want. Keeping around your old ideas and kind of realizing where your influences are coming from can be really helpful, and it can be sort of useful to sort of have those creative moments, but to turn them into something like a bunch of notes or like a stub of a document or something. Those can be useful later on when you need to do something more concrete. So, like another example of having ideas or projects or things that are helpful later on is drawing maps for levels. And it may seem counterintuitive because in a digital video game, like the drawing of a map isn't that helpful. But what it is really good at is it's really good at getting your ideas down and sort of on paper and sort of like outside of an editor environment. And when you're in sort of a digital editor and when you're trying to build a certain thing, you run into a lot of problems because you're fighting with the tools a little bit, and it can be really hard to sort of sketch out an idea very quickly. Whereas if you're just trying to get an idea down, you can sort of get an idea on paper a lot faster and sort of start thinking about, maybe some slightly higher level stuff without the details of the implementation. Like a big part of level design is the combat encounters you'll have or the different moment to moment sort of setup of things. You could also be thinking about like the balance of space or like this or like concepts around that. I was talking mostly about like high level ideas and documents, but also like even smaller scale things like maybe the particular mechanic you thought was really interesting, or maybe you thought that there was you did that level, or you did that little like piece of art on the side, or that little thing. Like those are all sort of helpful. You never know when they're going to come back for you, and it's nice to sort of keep them around and have them in your back pocket.